Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we have an interesting set of frames along with their license here in the Tokugawa line, who are the energy berserkers of Harrison Armory, and honestly, especially with the Tokugawa, probably the most high damage frame in the game, but simultaneously being, a glass cannon. So this is a very interesting mech line, and so if you enjoy running into enemies, putting your life on the line to rip them to shreds, this might be the frame for you. But let's go ahead and take a look at the stats so you can judge for yourself. All right, so looking at the base attributes, we have a somewhat tanky frame. I mean, we have average armor, average HP, average evasion, but an abysmal E defense. That kind of gets paired up with its -2 tech attacks, so the Tokugawa does not want to be anywhere near any kind of tech actions, whether using them or having them used against it. Now, it does have an above average heat capacity at 8, which is pretty significant, and decent sensors, which is very interesting. I don't know why its sensors are this big, but whatever, I guess. It doesn't really matter. Its repair capacity is also on the low end of average, with a higher than average save target and a pretty decent speed, I think, being on the low end of average there as well. They also have technically below average, but honestly, most mechs have 6 system points. So yeah, we have essentially a pretty decent frame that just goes away from tech actions as much as possible and instead has a really good heat capacity and a really good save target. Plus, 1 armor is honestly not that bad, but that's not going to be anything meaningful, as we're going to look at what makes the Tokugawa. So right out, we have Limit Break, which is very cool, and I understand the naming convention, but I can't help but think of Final Fantasy whenever I hear it. Regardless, completely irrelevant. So whenever the Tokugawa is exposed, now if you're unfamiliar, exposed means essentially you always take double damage from whatever source you take damage from. That's really devastating, and that means that while you're exposed, your armor value essentially counts as half instead, which is pretty nasty. Now, when you are exposed, though, your ranged and melee attacks deal +3 bonus damage on hit. All weapons that would deal kinetic or explosive damage instead deal energy damage, so essentially all weapons deal energy damage. And your ranges increase by +5 for ranged weapons, or +1 for melee weapons, +1 threat specifically, which is really good. Plus, like, increasing your range is really, really hard in this game, only with like a core bonus or pretty much something like this. So that's really good, but being exposed, 1, is hard unless you're the Tokugawa, because you need an enemy to expose you, and 2 is putting your life on the line. But that's not the end of it, because we also have Plasma Sheath. So whenever it's in the danger zone, or whenever your heat capacity is at half or higher, any attacks with weapons that deal any amount of energy damage all become burn damage instead, which is really nasty. Or sorry, all bonus damage becomes burn, which is really nasty, and this pairs perfectly. So that +3 energy damage bonus that we're getting to all of our attacks are being converted to burn. So we're doing energy damage plus burn, which means that it's automatically armor piercing, and there's just a chance they don't lose the burn and take it again on the next turn at the end of their turn, which is really good and highly damaging. And also, +3 damage is actually a lot. That's a pretty significant bonus damage modifier in this game, considering most other bonus damages are like a D6. So, and I understand technically a D6 on average is 3.5 or 4, but +3 is still really, really good. And it's always that no matter what. So averaging out, it's going to be pretty much as good, if not 0.5 difference less. And skipping the weapon mounts real quick, let's talk about its core systems, because this is how we tie everything together. So, how do we get exposed? Well, we have overclock, which as a protocol, you become exposed until the end of your next turn. So one of the benefits of overclock is that it doesn't always take up your overclock slot. because it pretty much preps you for this turn and next turn. So if you have another protocol you wish to use, overclock's not that bad. And there we go. That's how we get exposed. And to add extra benefit, when we use our core power, we get the benefit of Radiance, which as a protocol, which I already just mentioned here, how protocol works. You activate this core power and any weapons that deal energy damage gain 5 range if they're ranged or +2 threat. And this does stack with Limit Break. That's honestly pretty cool. And honestly, Radiance is really not that bad because there's no other stipulations. You just activate your core power and you essentially extend your range for many weapons, doubling it even. And then whenever you become exposed, you enhance that even further. This is insane and can make for some of the furthest range sniping potential in the game, which is really interesting. And it also sets the Tokugawa up strangely to be a really good artillery mech, which is interesting. And honestly, it kind of more leans that way, as when you're exposed, you would take double damage. So being as far away from the enemies as possible seems like a good idea. It's very bizarre, the overall design that they got going here. And honestly, the +3 threat for some weapons that can make them essentially a medium range melee weapon, which is really, really cool. Now let's talk about the weapon mounts. So we have we have one flex mount and 2 main mounts here. This is okay, and I feel like it's balanced because the Tokugawa is so powerful, getting just bonus damage baked into its kit. So no heavy mount makes sense, but getting 2 main mounts over over at least like 2 flex mounts is a little lame in my opinion. Now you can retrofit one of these to a main aux, and that's probably one of the best ways to go about it in my opinion. But I don't know. It's something that I don't like the mounts, but I completely understand because honestly, auxiliary weapons are insanely damaging on the Tokugawa with the +3 energy bonus just flat when you're exposed. So I get it. Mix this in with some of the long range like Nexus weapons or whatever, and you got a very terrible mix of high damage, quick fire, full barrages heading your way. That's really scary, and it makes the Tokugawa insanely cool. I actually really like this mech. Its design is like a berserker. It goes full out and you wreck enemies, high risk, high reward. My problems is it wants to always be on the brink of being destroyed. And I actually, my players played against a Tokugawa in our live play as one of the final episodes in our live play. And that Tokugawa went down real fast. Now, granted, I was operating 5 mechs as the GM at the time, so I wasn't really using them all to their best. But that being the case, the Tokugawa is just so squishy because it wants to be squishy to get most of its benefits. I do like the mech, and I think there's some very interesting plays for it. But if you are going to play the Tokugawa, you have to invest in as much hull as possible, and you're also going to want to invest probably in some engineering to get your heat cap higher, which is a little bit counterintuitive because that makes it a little bit harder to get into the danger zone, but it gives you a much bigger danger zone to work with, more or less. So that all being said, let's go ahead and talk about the Enkidu, which is the variant frame in this license. So now we have the Enkidu, which you might notice is a striker and defender frame. I don't really know. I mean, I guess I understand how it's a defender frame, but it's not a defender frame in the normal sense. It's also a size 2, and it is technically the progenitor of the Enkidu, or of the Tokugawa, which is very interesting. But there's some lore stuff behind this one that I don't really like, even though I guess it does make sense when you actually think about it. It's a primal mech. Yeah, it's a primal mech that makes people essentially go berserk when they're using it. Now, this was done so that essentially the fighting forces on Hercynian would be able to fight against essentially the Third Commission, which I guess makes understand. Like the Third Commission did a lot of really terrible things, but this just seems like a bad mech by design because it just makes the pilots go insane. And operating the mechs is incredibly difficult. Them needing to be essentially juiced up on a cocktail of different things just to keep them functioning. It's no wonder that this got turned into the Tokugawa. Regardless, it's a very interesting mech, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. So stat-wise, we see a lot of similar things, though we do see a higher than average HP of 10, and a normal E defense, though a -2 to tech. So this mech is absolutely not designed to use any tech actions. It's also slower at a speed 3, but that actually makes sense, and it has less of a save target and less of a system point with the same heat capacity and a little bit of a better repair capacity. So overall, we have a slightly more defensive mech that does not have as good as saves, is not as fast base speed wise, which just gets altered, and has less system points to work with. Now, those aren't necessarily bad, and the Enkidu, unlike the Tokugawa, is not based on being exposed. So this mech is actually way more tanky than the Tokugawa, just by the grace of not wanting to be exposed. Though compared to other tanky mechs, it's really not that tanky. Though it does have a pretty decent evasion, despite its more tanky stats. So honestly, it's not too bad. Not the best in the line, and honestly, it's not really a defender mech. So why is it a defender mech? Let's look at the traits, because this is where the defender quality comes in. And that actually comes from, ironically, Primal Fury. Now, similar to the Tokugawa, this mech also gets benefits when it's in its danger zone, but this time it gets a unique mode it goes into. So when it ends its turn in the danger zone, it extends its plasma talons, which we'll look at here in a moment, and it becomes a zone defender, but with a bit of a catch. So let's go with the catch first, actually. So as a special reaction, the Enkidu must use its plasma talons to attack any character, hostile or allied, that enters, exits, or moves more than one space within its threat. This is a special reaction that can be used once per turn and can be used any number of times around. So you could technically attack everyone on the map if they trigger this. And it doesn't count against your normal maximum number of reactions, so you can still use your normal reactions when you do so. Now, when you hit anyone with your plasma talons, they become immobilized until the end of their next turn, which is utterly devastating. Essentially, what the Enkidu wants to do is it wants to sit in a zone and lock everyone out of it by forcing enemies to essentially go around or be ripped to shreds, which is really cool, but this works both ways. Your allies also can't operate really well within the zone. Now, your allies can actually be in the zone as long as they don't move, which is interesting. And technically enemies are the same, but this can gum up the works if not used appropriately. And so your team essentially has to work around you, or they need to understand that when you go into this mode, they should stop moving, which, can be a kind of a bad thing from time to time. Now, this mode ends at the start of your next turn, or if you exit the danger zone for whatever reason. So that being the case, you never get to use the plasma talons, I guess, when you're not in your primal fury mode. So let's take a look at the plasma talons here. So the plasma talons are a threat 3, which is a massive range, especially when you consider this is a size 2 mech, so its like emanation zone is essentially bigger than other mechs. Now it's also an auxiliary melee weapon. Nothing discounts it from the benefits of any auxiliary melee weapon talents, which is kind of cool. And they do a good amount of damage. They do a D3 plus 2, which is insanely good for an auxiliary weapon, armor piercing damage, and they're reliable too. Meaning that even if you miss, you're still doing 2 energy piercing damage anyway, which is really very good. Now you do need to be in the danger zone, but that's irrelevant because you only get it in this mode. Now, From my understanding, you can only use this when you trigger your Primal Fury, because it says your claws extend, which means I guess you just don't get access to this any other time, which seems very weird, but I guess that's just how it is, because there's no like Primal Fury mode down here. It says extends, which you would think, okay, increase the range of, but there's no like non-extended range. So yeah, I guess you just only use your Plasma Talons when you are in your Primal Fury mode, which I feel kind of sucks, but they are really, really good weapons, even if they're not the highest damaging weapons you could possibly use. So it is what it is. I don't know. I think they could have just kept them on all the time and it wouldn't have been as big a deal. Now, let's look at its other traits here. We have all fours. Now, this is where the slow speed kind of makes more sense for this primal mech, because when you're in the danger zone, you can't make range attacks, but you gain a base speed of 6 instead. And it also says you can't reuse tech attacks, which, I mean, you weren't going to do anyway. So base speed 6 is good, which means that this is a really, really fast mech, a really fast, kind of sturdy mech too. One of the faster mechs in the game when it's in the danger zone. Though this does mean that the Enkidu just doesn't want any range weapons on it, because why would you? You get your best effect when you're in the danger zone, and when you're in the danger zone, you can't make range attacks. So this is a melee mech. This is only a melee mech, which isn't a bad thing, but I'm sure everyone who's played Lancer a decent amount has had frustrating points where they didn't have good long-range weapons in some combat scenarios. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, its brute strength is also really cool. It gets a +1 accuracy on all hull checks and saves, which means this is a really good grappling mech, really good for ramming and all kinds of other really good things. And it has a blood sense, which is very interesting. Essentially, enemies that are at half or under their maximum HP get eliminated, but you don't know how much HP they currently have. This is important for the use of their other core system, which is their activate by bifurcate or bifurcate, whatever. And this is a protocol, so you have to use it at the beginning of your turn and a full action, so it takes up both your actions. What you do is you spend a core point at the beginning of your turn to activate this, and then you spend a full action to target an adjacent character. Now it says allied or hostile, but I don't know why you would do this on an allied character ever, and attempts to tear them in half with its talon. Now, if the target has 7 or less HP and only one structure remaining, which, to be fair, this is a lot of enemies in the game. They only have one structure very typically, and they aren't currently immune to damage, so you can't use this on like a Lich, for instance. They're immediately destroyed. The action cost for the ability is then refunded, so you actually get your full action back, and the Enkidu can boost as a free action. If this action fails to destroy the target, though, the target instead takes 1 kinetic damage. If you do fail to kill the enemy, there is I guess a small glimmer where at the end of the scene, you actually get your CP back if you fail to destroy any characters using this ability. So that's good at the very least. Oh, and it can only use this action in the danger zone, which, I mean, it just wants to be in the danger zone. So, Nuclear Cavalier, here we come, because that only benefits your use of this. I think Bifurcate is very interesting, and there's a lot of ways that you can easily read enemy HP, so I think it's a really good one to just instantly finish off a tankier enemy, but 7 damage is also just not a lot for a lot of enemies, so I don't know, spending 1 core point to essentially get rid of an enemy, granted, if you manage to do so, you get the actions back at least, which is good. It just seems like not worth it for a core points expenditure. But it's got a lot of other really cool things. I mean, the Primal Fury is devastatingly powerful. Now, real quick, let's go and take a look at its mounts here. It has 2 flex mounts. That's it. I don't know why the Tokugawa couldn't get 2 flex mounts, but here it is. I don't think that it needed only 2 mounts to make this a balanced mech. It just doesn't have the same damage output, doesn't have the same defensive quality. This mech kind of just doesn't do a whole lot as both a defender and an artillery mech. You could say Primal Fury makes it good for zoning, but that's more of a control effect, if you ask me personally. there's nothing defending about it. You just stop enemies from going through a certain area, or you get into a bunch of enemies and then you stop them from moving altogether. As a defender, this is not a mech I would pick as a defender. As a striker, I think this one is a lot more interesting in that respect because it can lock down in a zone and, at least do a bunch of damage to some enemies that are willing to go by you. And you're pretty fast as well, and your blood sense and bifurcate do allow you to bypass a lot of things. It's a very interesting mech. I don't know. And I think one of the other things that is at least a small upside is you want the same kind of stats as a Tokugawa. You want a good amount of hull because you might as well just increase your defensive quality, right? And some engineering for some of the other features that we're going to find here in the license in just a moment. Maybe some system points too. Maybe agility though. So like this might take some points away from your Tokugawa frame if you're trying to use like both mechs essentially. So just something to keep in mind. I do think it's not a bad frame, but I just don't know its purpose when you just compare it to some other frames in the license. But as a kind of an additional pickup with the Tokugawa, honestly, it's not that bad. So overall, I think this is not a bad frame as an additional, or as a frame variant rather. All right, so starting off here at rank 1, we have the Annihilator, a range 5, threat 3, close quarters combat accessory shotgun weapon, does a D3+2, which is not too bad. Same damage as the plasma talons on the Enkidu, which is very interesting, but this one has an additional effect. Make a secondary attack against all characters within a burst 1 of the target of your attack. These attacks can't deal bonus damage and don't trigger the Annihilator's heat or secondary attacks. Oh yeah, this weapon also is armor piercing and does heat. Not a bad shotgun, not a lot of damage, but considering it's a shotgun essentially that can do area damage to an enemy, and when you consider the fact that on the Tokugawa, this can have up to a range 15 when you're exposed, you get a long range sniping shotgun that does armor piercing damage, and it does area damage to all enemies around it. And in addition to that, your threat will become 3 further. So enemies running up on you are going to get shot by this as well. Honestly, on the Tokugawa, this is really fun. Very cool. Don't want to use this on the Enkidu though, as it's a ranged weapon and you're just going to lose access to it anyway. So yeah, really good for the Tokugawa and a very interesting weapon, though it mostly works for the Tokugawa, but for any mech frames you want to do a little bit of splash damage with and generate heat for yourself, for those of you who love Nuclear Cavalier, honestly, not a bad weapon. External batteries is an interesting one, and it doesn't work really well on the Tokugawa. So what it does is for 2 system points, you put external batteries on your mech, which gives your range weapons a +5 range and a +1 threat. Now, why this doesn't really work on the Tokugawa is standardly, like flat bonus, static bonuses are only one can affect a certain thing at a time, as stated in the rules. The only reason why Limit Break works with their core power for the Tokugawa is because it states specifically, being the specific rule. So while you're exposed, external batteries does nothing, and while you use your core system, external batteries does nothing on the Tokugawa. I guess this is not a bad thing to use on your Tokugawa so that you get the benefits of your stuff essentially when you're not exposed, which can be good, except when you take any structure damage, this system is automatically destroyed and you take 1d6 armor piercing explosive damage from the explosion. And this damage can't be prevented or reduced in any way, so nothing can save you from this. That is not good. And also, when you take structure damage, there's just a chance that you lose 2 systems, or a system and a weapon, at the same time. And neither of the frames have any good amounts of system points to really make that kind of gamble. So this is a good pickup for a lot of other frames. Now, for the Enkidu, this one's not so bad, as honestly, if you invest a lot in hull, a d6 AP explosive damage is not a big deal. And this can just extend the range of your plasma talons or any other range or melee weapon that you have, which is pretty cool. So I think this is a good one on a lot of other frames. Sucks on the Tokugawa, which makes this a baffling system for the Tokugawa to even have. And I don't know, 2 system points I think is balanced. I don't know. I think this is good for a lot of specific types of frames, but not for any squishy frames, which the Tokugawa leans to. At rank 2, along with the Enkidu and the Tokugawa, we have the Torch, a very good main melee weapon. It doesn't have a very far range, but on the Tokugawa, you can easily extend that, and if you're using the Enkidu with the batteries, not too bad either. It's a 1-threat main melee weapon with a D6 energy damage and 3 burn. A D6 and 3 burn? I mean, that's just 3 armor-piercing damage on top of a D6. This is really good. It's better than the shotgun, except it doesn't do area damage, so single target. The Torch is really good, though obviously at a much reduced range, and it has overkill, which is also really good, ensuring that you always do a good amount of damage. Now, this also does 2 heat to you, so high risk, high reward, but honestly, for a main melee weapon, if you don't mind the short range, the Torch is a good one. I wouldn't count it as like what your build weapon should be about. Like, this should be a good off weapon for whatever main weapons you're currently using for the build. Though I really do like the Torch. I think it's really good. It just burns through enemies, which is really good. Burn's always really, really good. So overall, this one gets a thumbs up from me. Deepwell Heatsink. 4 system points. 4. That's a lot. Most of the most powerful, like, NHPs or other systems in the game max out around 3, so 4 is really spendy. Now, what the benefit of this one is when you enter, or when you're in the danger zone, you get resistance to heat for the rest of the turn. This effect persists even if you leave the danger zone during your turn. Now, it's when you start your turn in the danger zone. So, while that's a good effect, I think 4 system points is really strong. Now, of course, I understand resistance to heat is insanely powerful. It can let you overcharge more easily. It can let you use weapons more easily. There are some mechs that would really love something like this. But something those mechs tend to share in common is a lack of system points to really utilize this. And like from base Tokugawa, this is almost all of your system points to put on. So unless you're investing in system points, is this really worth it? Is this a thing that you would want on your build? I don't think so. There's not a lot of mechs I feel like can spend 4 system points for, unless they're very heavily invested in having a lot of system points and also just don't like having heat but also getting into the danger zone. I don't know. That's just a lot. If they made this 3 system points, this would be a very, very, very good system. But I feel like 4 is just 1 point too many. I don't know. Maybe y'all think differently. Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to hear some of your theory crafting around the use of this particular system. Because honestly, to me, the price is not really worth the benefit that this gives. All right, so we're getting to the end of the Tokugawa video. I know this video takes a long time. I mean, whenever I have 2 frames to look through, there's always a lot to talk about. But if you enjoy this kind of content, I recommend subscribing. I talk about Lancer videos at least once a week with some odd, fun events that we do in the Discord, which is linked in the description. We recently had a video where we looked at a top 5 community builds, which was really fun. Or at the very least, if you want more people to hear about Lancer, leave a like. It makes this channel much more visible to other people on YouTube. So I'd highly appreciate it. But let's go ahead and get to the final rank of the Tokugawa license. Illusory class NHP, 3 system points. Now that's, compared to Deepwell, 1 less, and honestly, a much better effect in my opinion, because not only is this an NHP, which is an AI, which is always really cool, but you gain the Lucifer Protocol, which is, there's been no cooler name for a system, honestly. You expend a charge, it starts at limited 2, and to give your next range or melee attack a bonus damage on hit equal to your current heat after activating this protocol, which this protocol does do, a D3 plus 3 heat to yourself. This is excellent for getting any frame, really, most frames, into the danger zone right away. Now, the weapon does need to deal energy damage to get the bonus damage from this effect. And something about the Tokugawa as well is when you're exposed, you get the higher of either your limit break or Lucifer Protocol. Now, this is something that I would say you probably would just, I mean, first of all, depending on, I guess, when your cycle is, because when you use your overclock, like you would use this instead of your overclock, essentially, which isn't a bad thing. And this gives the Tokugawa a safer way to deal damage once you've built a significant amount of heat in the game. And honestly, I mean, the bonus damage is going to be higher than your limit break anyway. Like on average, it's going to be a 0.5 higher, I guess. So this almost replaces limit break and makes you just less exposed, though you don't get the massive range increases, which is something to keep in mind. I think Lucifer Protocol is insanely good, can be used on a lot of frames as long as you're using some kind of energy weapons. And again, I just want to point out, compared to the Deep Well Heat Sink, which is 4 system points, and all it really does is give you resistance to heat on your turn. Not even like until the start of your next turn. On your turn. This just feels so much more valuable to me. So overall, insanely good. I really, really like this one. And I think this works super well for the Tokugawa. And you know what? Honestly, for the Enkidu as well, as they both have pretty high heat capacities. And last up, we have Plasma Gauntlet. Will this be another kind of stinker of a system right at the end? We'll see, because honestly, I have mixed feelings on this one. This one is 2 system points, though, which is something that's important to keep in mind. And it can be only used in the danger zone, requires a quick action, and essentially you choose an adjacent character to you. They need to make an agility save or take 4d6 armor piercing energy damage and be knocked prone. Now, on a success specifically, on a success, they take half the damage and aren't knocked prone, but you take half of the damage you inflict with this no matter what. So even if they succeed, you take half of the damage inflicted as heat. And this is before any reduction. So if you have any way of reducing heat, which Deep Well Heat Sink might come into effect, it is not so bad. But so 4d6 has an average damage of 14, which is really good, which means this is 7 heat on average coming to you. That's an insane amount of heat, and it isn't even the worst part. You also become stunned until the start of your next turn. Also, this is a limited 1 system. So, unless you have engineering invested in, you get 1 use of this. It stuns you until the start of your next turn. And that's the thing, right? This has such a high cost for doing possibly 14 damage, not likely, possibly 14 damage. I mean, technically a max capacity of 24, I believe, if I'm doing my math right. And knocking the enemy prone, or they taking half of whatever you do, and then you take a good amount of heat, more than likely, and then become stunned. Now, stunned is also another part of this that is just, I mean, you lose your reactions, which is pretty devastating. And the only mechs that really want to lose their reactions are snipers, because there's not typically a lot of reactions that artillery mechs have they can use, though there are a decent amount still, but they're less likely to. Defenders, who at least, you know, might not have any, it's still kind of really scary. This would suck on the Enkidu. Like, the only time you're using Plasma Gauntlet is when you are sure it's going to kill the enemy that you're up against, which, to be fair, 4d6 armor piercing damage is nothing to sniff at. They could have removed stunned from this, and I feel like it would have been more worthwhile to have, because taking as much heat as this can do without like Heat Well Deep Sink is going to be deadly. You know, that's a lot of heat. That's a lot of heat if you don't have any resistance to heat. And as far as I know, no frames innately have resistance to heat, only really to burn. So that's something that I feel like is I don't know. I don't know when using this would be good, other than the fact that this can be a very powerful finisher. And even then, you kind of want to go surefire and only use this when the enemy just does not have a lot left in the tank. Or, I will make mention, if an enemy is stunned, they automatically fail the agility save. So that's technically well, not free, but it's an easy 4d6 armor piercing energy damage on that enemy, as long as you feel like your systems can take the heat, which, you know, get a really good roll and you might just burn your reactor out. I don't know. Plasma Gauntlet seems cool. It's only 2 system points, which is honestly like what would make me consider this. If it was 3, I just wouldn't even consider it, honestly. So 2 system points to do a finisher, meh. I mean, like, it can be cool, but becoming stunned until the start of your next turn is really bad. It just removes a lot of reactions, and reactions are honestly some of the funnest parts of the game. So use at your own peril. I don't know. I'm lift mixed on this one. If I was to get if I was to rate this out of 10, it'd be a 6. Like, I could see some use for it, but I wouldn't want to use it as much as, like, to the point where there's going to be a lot of battles where it might just be 2 dead system points that I just don't utilize during the entire fight. So, I don't know. But that's going to be it for the Tokugawa. It's a very interesting one. It's very much the high risk, high reward. If you enjoy gambling, this is going to be the frame for you. And honestly, I think the Tokugawa has a lot of potential. Enkidu, very interesting. I'm not necessarily as big of a fan of it, but, you know, what have you. I do like both the Annihilator and the Torch weapons, and I do think external batteries has a use. It's just a little scary, but on like a super range mech, honestly, it's a pretty solid pickup. Next time, what mech are we going to be looking at? I believe it's the Kid. It is. We're going to be looking at the Kid next time. So if you want, stay tuned for that, but that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.